Knowledge was power, but only for the chosen few. Until now. Today, education feels like the foundation of our lives. Children fill classrooms, young people dream of universities, and adults keep learning through screens. But for most of history, this was unthinkable. For thousands of years, knowledge belonged only to the elite. In ancient times, philosophers taught only free men. In the Middle Ages, the church guarded learning behind its walls. Until the Industrial Revolution, education reaching ordinary people was almost impossible. Think about it. Today, hundreds can learn to read together, but just 500 years ago, a village might not have had a single literate person. Education was a privilege, not a right, and it didn't just shape knowledge, it shaped civilizations. How societies rose, what inventions they made, how they were governed, all flowed from their idea of education. So let's trace this journey from ancient philosophers to AI-powered classrooms and uncover the 2,500-year evolution of learning. Education's story begins in ancient Greece, but it wasn't for everyone. Only free male citizens could study. Women, slaves, and foreigners, completely excluded. Education was a privilege, not a right. Young boys learned reading, writing, and basic math. They trained their bodies for war through sports and gymnastics. But the real education came later, in the schools of the philosophers. Socrates questioned everything. Plato built his academy. Aristotle taught at the Lyceum. These weren't just schools, they were laboratories for thought, shaping how humans reasoned for the next 2,000 years. Rome took this foundation and turned it practical. Instead of philosophy alone, Roman children trained in rhetoric, law, and military discipline. The ideal Roman citizen wasn't just wise, he was persuasive, disciplined, and ready to serve the empire. The common thread? Education wasn't about personal growth or curiosity. It was about creating citizens who could hold the state together. In Greece, the philosopher shaped the mind of the city. In Rome, the speaker and soldier held the empire. Imagine this. Today, millions of children sit in classrooms around the world. But in the ancient world, education touched only a tiny fraction of society. And knowledge itself was the ultimate form of power. When the Roman Empire collapsed, not only cities and roads fell into ruin, the education system did too. Knowledge found a new home inside churches and monasteries. In the Middle Ages, literacy was an extraordinary privilege. For most people, education simply didn't exist. Knowledge was locked away in Latin manuscripts, guarded by priests. Monastic schools taught children prayers, scripture, and Latin, but only the sons of nobles could attend. The church both preserved and controlled learning. Education was framed as a path to God. Worldly knowledge had little place. Mathematics and natural sciences were almost completely ignored. Learning wasn't meant to change the world. It was meant to save the soul. Daily life went on without education. A farmer didn't need to read or write to survive. But because the church held the keys to knowledge, it also held the power to guide and dominate society. And there was another barrier: books themselves. Every manuscript was copied by hand, a process that took months or even years. That made books incredibly rare and expensive, stored only in monastery libraries. Education was designed not for the people, but for the devoted few. Yet even in this restricted world, seeds of change were quietly growing. Contact with the Islamic world through trade and crusades reintroduced forgotten Greek and Roman texts back into Europe. These ideas would slowly chip away at the church's monopoly on learning and prepare the ground for a revolution in education, the Renaissance. In the 12th and 13th centuries, a new institution appeared in Europe, the university. Cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford became home to these early schools. At first, they were created to train clergy, but over time their focus widened. Law, medicine, and philosophy entered the curriculum. Education was no longer hidden inside monasteries. It now stood in the center of Europe's great cities. The Renaissance literally rebirthed, transformed education. Forgotten works of ancient Greece and Rome were rediscovered, translated, and taught. Students and scholars were no longer limited to scripture. They turned their eyes to nature, humanity, and the universe itself. This shift sparked an explosion of ideas. Galileo's telescope, Copernicus's heliocentric model, Newton's laws of motion, all grew from this new environment of learning. Universities quickly became not just places where knowledge was preserved, but where knowledge was created. Debate, discussion, and experimentation flourished. Unlike the one-way teaching of the Middle Ages, education now encouraged questioning, testing, and discovering. This change also reshaped society. It wasn't only nobles who sought education anymore. The rising merchant class began sending their children to universities, turning learning into a path not just to salvation, but to status and power. By the end of the Renaissance, universities had laid the foundation for modern science in the modern world. They remain, even today, among the oldest surviving institutions of human civilization. The 18th and 19th centuries brought the Industrial Revolution, and with it, an entirely new world. Steam engines powered factories, cities grew at record speed, and new industries demanded a new kind of worker, literate, disciplined, and trained from childhood. This is where the modern system of mass education was born. Governments introduced mandatory primary schooling, ensuring that every child would learn to read, write, and handle basic arithmetic. Education was no longer an elite privilege. For the first time, it became a structured part of ordinary life, a standardized curriculum. The teacher stood at the front, students sat quietly in their seats. This was no accident. Schools were modeled after the discipline of factories. Punctuality, obedience, and uniformity were just as important as knowledge. Curriculums also reflected national priorities. In France, children learned the ideals of the revolution. In Germany, discipline and order were emphasized. In Britain, the glory of the empire was taught. Education wasn't just shaping workers, it was shaping citizens and building the identity of entire nations. And change wasn't limited to boys. For the first time, girls were gradually admitted to schools, opening the door to literacy for half of society that had long been excluded. The Industrial Revolution laid the foundation for the school system we still recognize today. Within just a few generations, millions of people learned to read and write for the very first time. And that transformed not just factories, but the entire trajectory of human civilization. The 20th century was not just about expanding education. It was about making it equal for everyone. Schools were no longer seen only as places to train workers. They became engines of social change. One of the most dramatic shifts was the full inclusion of women. Just a few centuries earlier, girls were often banned from classrooms. Now, women not only attended school but became professors, scientists, and leaders. This didn't just change individual lives, it reshaped entire societies. Educating women became one of the most powerful steps toward democracy and equality. This era was also defined by the ideal of equal opportunity. A child's future should not depend on the class they were born into, but on the education they received. Public schools, scholarships, and free education programs spread across nations, turning schools into bridges across social divides. But the century was also scarred by war. World War I and II showed how education could be used both ways. As propaganda to mold obedient citizens, or as a tool to build peace. After the devastation, new institutions like UNESCO were created to make education a foundation for global cooperation and stability. Perhaps the most important milestone came in 1948, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights declared, "Everyone has the right to education." For the first time in history, education was not just a privilege or a policy, it was recognized as a universal human right. By the end of the 20th century, education had become more than a personal advantage. It was the cornerstone of democracy, equality, and human rights. In the 21st century, education has broken free from the classroom walls. From university lectures to online courses, from YouTube videos to AI-powered apps, knowledge is more accessible than at any point in history. Today, a student can learn from a professor on the other side of the world without ever leaving their home. For the first time, education has truly become a global experience. At the same time, learning is becoming personalized. AI can now adapt to a student's pace, interests, and style of learning. We are moving away from a one-size-fits-all curriculum toward an era of individualized education. But this revolution comes with challenges. Millions of children without access to technology risk falling behind. The digital age expands opportunities, yet creates new inequalities. Education today lives in two worlds, the traditional classroom and the ever-growing realm of screens. algorithms, and digital platforms. The journey of education has taken us from the small schools of philosophers to the monasteries of the Middle Ages, from the factory-style classrooms of the Industrial Revolution to today's digital screens. In every era, education shaped the destiny of society. Who would hold power, which ideas would survive, and which inventions would change the world? Today, knowledge is more accessible than ever before, but also more fragmented, faster, and more fragile. On one hand, AI can tailor learning to each student's pace. On the other, millions of children still lack access to even the most basic education. So here's the great question. Where will the classroom of the future be? Inside schools, on our screens, or directly in our minds? Perhaps, just like in the past, education will never be only a place, but the clearest mirror of humanity's journey